I never meant to cross into Alpha territory that night. The snow had been falling for hours, soft and endless, swallowing the path behind me until the forest no longer looked familiar. My cloak was damp at the edges, my fingers numb as I pulled it tighter around myself, breathing slowly so panic wouldn't rise in my chest. Omega instinct told me to turn back, but there was nowhere left to go. The border stones appeared through the snowfall without warning, dark, ancient markers half buried beneath white drifts. I stopped when I saw them, heart pounding gently, not with fear, but with something quieter, something I didn't have a name for yet. Omegas did not wander into Alpha lands alone, especially not at night, and especially not during winter, when tempers ran cold and borders mattered more than kindness. I stood there longer than I should have, snow settling quietly on my hair and shoulders, the forest holding its breath around me. My pulse slowed as I made a choice I didn't feel brave enough to name. One step. The moment my boot pressed into the untouched snow beyond the stone, something shifted. Not in the world, but in me. A faint warmth stirred low in my chest, subtle enough that I almost missed it, like the first spark from flint before the flame truly catches. I drew a slow breath and continued forward. The forest on the Alpha side felt different, quieter somehow. The trees stood taller, their branches heavy with snow, forming a sheltered path that guided me deeper inside. Each step felt watched, not in a threatening way, but with a presence I couldn't see. I kept my head down, focusing on the sound of my breathing, the crunch of snow beneath my boots. By the time I saw the light, my legs were trembling with cold. It glowed softly through the trees, warm amber against the blue night. A cabin, nestled into the slope of the hill, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. I stopped again, doubt rising in my throat. Alphas did not offer shelter lightly. And I was an Omega alone, my scent dampened by snow but not erased. Still, the cold was beginning to seep into my bones. I approached slowly, each step careful, until I stood at the edge of the clearing. The cabin looked lived in, solid and steady, as if it had been there long before borders were drawn, and would remain long after they were forgotten. The door opened before I could raise my hand. He stood there framed by warm firelight, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair dusted with snow as if he'd only just stepped inside himself. His eyes met mine, and in that instant, the quiet warmth in my chest flared, not fear, recognition. His gaze softened immediately, not sharp or assessing, but calm, steady in a way that made my shoulders relax despite myself. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at me, as if measuring something deeper than the rules I had broken. "You'll freeze out here," he said finally, his voice low and even, carrying easily through. The cold air. I swallowed. "I didn't mean to cross the border." "I know," he replied, as if the truth of that was obvious. For a moment neither of us moved. Snow drifted between us, slow and quiet. The world narrowed to the space we shared. I became acutely aware of the faint pull in my chest, the way my breathing seemed to align with his without effort. He stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said gently. "You're safe here tonight." As I crossed the threshold, warmth wrapped around me, firelight, the scent of wood and smoke, and beneath it all, something unmistakable. Alpha, calm, steady. The door closed softly behind me, and though I didn't know it yet, I had already stepped far beyond more than just a border. The door closed with a soft, final sound, shutting out the wind and the endless white beyond it. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the warmth sink into my skin. My fingers tingled painfully as feeling returned, and I tucked my hands into the sleeves of my cloak, breathing in slowly. The cabin was quiet in a way that felt intentional. A low fire burned in the hearth, its light flickering across stone walls and wooden beams worn smooth by time. Everything smelled faintly of pine and smoke, clean and grounding. It felt lived in, safe. "You can sit," he said gently, nodding toward a chair near the fire. "I'll bring you something warm." I hesitated, instinct urging me to stay standing, to remain ready to leave if needed. But the pull in my chest, that subtle warmth, encouraged me forward. I lowered myself into the chair, careful and slow, as if sudden movements might break the fragile calm between us. He moved quietly around the cabin, setting a kettle over the fire. I watched him from the corner of my eye, noticing the ease in his movements, the way he seemed entirely unbothered by my presence. There was no tension in his shoulders, no sharpness in his gaze when it returned to me. Only quiet awareness. "You're far from home," he said after a while. "Yes," I replied softly. "I didn't plan to be." He nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further. The kettle began to hum, and he poured the water into a simple mug, adding herbs that released a gentle, calming scent. When he handed it to me, his fingers brushed mine, just briefly, and the warmth in my chest pulsed again, stronger this time. I drew a slow breath, steadying myself. "Thank you." "Of course," he said. "Drink slowly." I obeyed, letting the heat spread through me, easing the tightness in my chest. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the wind seemed to fade into the distance, as if the world had agreed to give us this moment of quiet. He took a seat across from me, far enough to give me space, close enough that I could feel his presence. Alpha energy surrounded him, but it wasn't overwhelming. It felt contained, like a steady flame rather than a roaring fire. "I won't ask questions tonight," he said after a while. "You can rest here. Tomorrow, when the storm clears, we can decide what comes next." The kindness in his voice caught me off guard. My throat tightened, and I nodded, unsure I could speak without revealing how much his words meant to me. As the night stretched on, the storm outside softened to a whisper. I felt my body relax inch by inch, exhaustion settling in gently. My eyes grew heavy, and the pull in my chest eased into something warmer, steadier, a quiet connection I didn't yet understand. I didn't know then that this calm, this simple shared silence was the beginning of something neither of us could undo. Only that, for the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged exactly where I was. He rose from his chair when he noticed my eyelids beginning to droop, moving with the same unhurried calm I'd seen since I arrived. He added another log to the fire, the flames responding with a gentle crackle, then turned back toward me. "There's a bed in the next room," he said softly. "It's warm. You should rest." A familiar hesitation stirred in me, the instinct to refuse, to say I would be fine by the fire, to avoid imposing further. But my body was already betraying me, exhaustion pulling me downward like a tide. I nodded instead, clutching the mug between my hands as if it anchored me to the moment. He led the way down a short hallway, the firelight fading into a softer glow. The room he opened was simple and clean, a wide bed layered with thick blankets, the window half frosted with snow. A candle burned low on a small table, its flame steady and calm. "I'll be just outside," he said, "if you need anything." I hesitated, then asked quietly, "You're not worried?" His gaze met mine, steady and thoughtful. "No," he said simply. "I trust what I feel." That warmth in my chest stirred again, slow and certain. Once he'd gone, I shed my cloak and boots, sliding beneath the blankets with a sigh I hadn't realized I'd been holding back all night. The bed was warm, the kind of warmth that seeped deep into your bones rather than sitting on the surface. I lay there listening to the distant wind, the muted crackle of the fire, the quiet presence of another heartbeat nearby. Sleep came slowly, gently, like being lowered into water rather than pulled under. My thoughts drifted, tangled with the strange pull I felt toward the man in the other room. It wasn't urgent. It didn't demand anything of me. It simply existed. At some point in the night, I woke briefly, unsure what had stirred me. The cabin was still, wrapped in shadow and soft firelight, and then I felt it, not fear, not surprise, but awareness, a steady warmth, closer now, like a presence keeping watch. The door creaked softly. He didn't enter fully. He paused at the threshold, just long enough to be sure I was all right. I pretended to sleep, not wanting to disturb. The fragile peace of the moment. The air shifted slightly, his calm alpha scent brushing against my senses before retreating again. The door closed just as quietly as it had opened. I slept more deeply after that, wrapped in warmth and silence, dreaming of snow melting beneath moonlight, of borders fading into memory. Somewhere between sleep and waking, a thought settled gently into place. This wasn't just shelter. It was the beginning of something neither of us had named yet, something patient, something inevitable, waiting for the morning to arrive. I woke slowly, not to fear or urgency, but to warmth and quiet light. Morning had crept into the room without announcement, pale and silver through the frost-lined window. Snow still clung to the glass, but the storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt sacred. For a moment, I lay still beneath the blankets, listening to the steady hush of the world outside, to my own breathing, calm and even. It took a few heartbeats to remember where I was, the cabin, the Alpha, the border I had crossed. Instead of panic, a soft calm settled over me. The pull in my chest was still there, gentler now, like an ember banked carefully through the night. I sat up slowly, brushing my hair back from my face, and noticed fresh clothes folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Simple, soft fabric, clearly meant for comfort rather than display. A quiet knock sounded at the door. "Are you awake?" his voice asked, low and careful, as if he didn't want to startle me. "Yes," I replied, surprised by how steady I sounded. "I've made breakfast. No hurry." When I stepped back into the main room, the cabin looked different in daylight, warmer, more real. Sunlight touched the wooden table, the shelves lined with worn books, the hearth where embers still glowed faintly. He stood near the window, sleeves rolled back, watching the snow drift lazily from the trees. He turned when he sensed me, his gaze softening immediately. "You slept well." "I did," I said. "Thank you for everything." He nodded once, as if gratitude didn't need to be dissected. We ate together quietly. Warm bread, fruit, tea, the kind of simple meal that felt grounding. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It felt chosen. When the dishes were set aside, he leaned lightly against the table. "The storm has cleared. If you wish to leave, the path will be safe now." The words were offered without pressure, without expectation. I hesitated, my fingers curling lightly in the fabric of my borrowed sleeves. Leaving felt possible, but not easy. "And if I stay?" I asked quietly. His eyes met mine, steady and searching. For the first time, I saw something shift there, not dominance, not command, but careful consideration, respect. "Then you stay," he said simply, "for as long as you need." The warmth in my chest flared, slow and certain, spreading outward until it filled me completely. I realized then that whatever bond stirred between us wasn't demanding anything at all. It was waiting. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to wait with it. I stayed. Not because he asked me to, and not because the path beyond the border was blocked. I stayed because each morning I woke in that quiet cabin, the world felt softer, as if I had stepped into a place where nothing rushed me to decide who I was meant to be. The days unfolded gently, one after another. Snow still covered the forest, but the air was calmer now, the sky pale and open above the trees. He showed me the safe paths near the cabin, where the ground was steady and the branches heavy with frost. We walked side by side without touching, our footsteps falling into an easy rhythm. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful, chosen with care. I learned small things about him, that he preferred the quiet of the woods to the noise of court, that he had built the cabin himself long before he had taken on the weight of a crown. He didn't say the words Alpha King, but I felt the truth of it in the way the forest seemed to listen when he moved through it. In the evenings, we returned to the warmth of the fire. I helped where I could, chopping vegetables, stirring soup, folding blankets. It felt natural, as if my hands already knew the shape of this life. Sometimes we spoke, sometimes we didn't. The silence between us grew familiar, comforting rather than uncertain. At night, when I lay in the bed he had offered me again without question, I became aware of how the pull in my chest had changed. It was no longer a sudden flare, no longer something that startled me. It was steady now, a quiet thread connecting me to him even when we were in separate rooms. One evening, as the fire burned low, he broke the silence. "The bond," he said carefully, as if testing the word. "You feel it too." I nodded, my fingers tightening slightly around my mug. "I do." He studied the flames for a moment before looking at me again. There was no fear in his expression, no urgency, only honesty. "It doesn't have to mean anything yet," he said. "We don't have to name it or act on it." Relief washed through me, warm and slow. "Thank you." He inclined his head slightly, as if the gratitude belonged to both of us. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the wind moved through the trees like a quiet breath. That night, as I drifted toward sleep, I realized something simple and profound. The bond wasn't pulling me forward. It was holding me here, in this calm place between what was and what might be. The silence between us began to change, not by becoming louder, but by growing fuller. It was in the way he paused when handing me a cup of tea, his fingers lingering just long enough to acknowledge the warmth we both felt. In the way his gaze followed me through the cabin, never intrusive, always aware. And in the way my own thoughts began to circle back to him even when he was only a few steps away. The bond no longer surprised me. It settled into my days like a constant, gentle presence, a quiet knowing that I was not alone, even when we were apart. One afternoon, while the light outside softened into early dusk, I found him standing at the window, watching the tree line. Snowmelt dripped slowly from the branches, the forest shifting almost imperceptibly toward spring. "You're thinking about leaving," he said, not accusing, not tense. "I'm thinking about the world beyond this place," I admitted, "and how different it feels now." He nodded, as if he understood far more than I'd said aloud. "The world doesn't stop because we find somewhere that feels right," he said gently. "But that doesn't mean we have to rush back into it." I moved to stand beside him, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. The pull in my chest warmed, steady and reassuring. Outside, the forest breathed quietly around us, unbothered by borders or titles. "Whatever this is," I said softly, "it feels patient." He turned then, meeting my gaze fully. There was something open in his expression, something unguarded that hadn't been there before. "That's how it should be," he replied. "Anything real deserves time." We stood like that for a long moment, the unspoken stretching comfortably between us. No declarations, no promises, just shared presence. That night, as I lay beneath the blankets, I realized the bond was no longer something I was waiting to understand. It was something I was already living. And in that realization, sleep came easily, deep and untroubled, carrying with it the quiet certainty that whatever lay ahead would unfold in its own time, just as gently as everything else had so far. The next morning arrived without urgency. Light filtered through the trees in soft strands, catching on the melting snow and turning it briefly to silver. I moved through the cabin quietly, not wanting to disturb the peace that seemed to settle deeper each day. The kettle warmed on the hearth, the familiar sounds grounding me in the simple rhythm we had fallen into together. He joined me a short while later, his presence felt before I saw him. There was comfort in that now, in knowing when he was near without needing to look. He offered a small nod, a faint smile that felt reserved just for moments like this. We shared breakfast in companionable silence, the kind that no longer needed explanation. When we finished, he reached for his coat. "I need to walk the boundary today," he said. "The storm shifted a few markers." "I can stay here," I replied easily. He paused, considering me with that steady, thoughtful gaze. "You're welcome to come if you'd like." The offer surprised me, not because it felt sudden, but because it felt like a quiet invitation into his world. I nodded, warmth blooming softly in my chest. The forest greeted us with stillness as we stepped outside. The path wound gently through the trees, snow thinning beneath our boots. He walked at my pace without comment, never pulling ahead, never holding me back. When the border stones came into view, I stopped, studying them with new eyes. "They don't feel the same," I murmured. "No," he agreed. "Borders rarely do once you've crossed them for the right reasons." I looked at him then, truly looked, and understood something I hadn't allowed myself to name before. Staying had not been something that happened to me. It had been something I had chosen, again and again, with every quiet morning and unhurried evening. As we turned back toward the cabin, the bond between us felt different, not stronger, but clearer. It wasn't simply comfort anymore. It was intention. That night, as the fire burned low and the world outside settled into rest, I realized that whatever lay ahead would not pull me away from this place unless I wished it to. and for now, surrounded by warmth and quiet understanding, I wished to remain exactly where I was. The bond did not demand a future. It simply offered one, patiently waiting for me to decide when I was ready to step forward. That evening felt different, though nothing had changed. The fire burned as it always did, low and steady, casting soft shadows along the walls. Outside, the forest settled into night, the last traces of daylight fading into deep blue. I sat near the hearth, absently folding a blanket that didn't truly need folding, my thoughts drifting in slow circles. He watched me for a moment, before speaking. "You've been quieter today," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation offered with care. "I've been listening," I replied honestly. "To myself." He nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. He moved to sit across from me, not too close, not too far. The bond between us hummed softly, familiar now, like a low note held beneath everything else. "There will come a time," he said, choosing his words carefully, "when staying here won't be enough. Not because this place is lacking, but because the world will ask something of both of us." I felt the truth of that settle gently in my chest. "I know. What matters," he continued, "is that when that time comes, it's a choice, not a sacrifice." I met his gaze, seeing the quiet resolve there, the patience that had defined him from the beginning. "Then I want to choose," I said softly. "Not because of the bond, but because this feels right." Something in his expression softened further, the smallest shift, but it carried weight. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that felt like respect rather than authority. "That's all I would ever ask." Silence followed, warm and unhurried. The fire cracked softly, and outside, an owl called once before the forest fell quiet again. I realized then that the bond had changed once more, not by deepening, but by settling, as if it had found its place within me. Later, when I lay down to rest, I didn't wonder anymore how long I would stay. I knew I would leave when the time was right, and when I did, I would not be leaving empty-handed. I would carry this calm with me, this steady warmth, this gentle truth, wherever the path led next. The night passed without dreams, the kind of deep, restful sleep that leaves the mind clear and the heart steady. When morning came, it did so gently, light spilling across the floor in pale gold rather than waking me abruptly. I dressed slowly, aware of a quiet shift inside me. Not urgency, not fear, just readiness, the sense that something was forming even if it hadn't yet taken shape. He was already awake, standing outside when I stepped from the cabin. The air was crisp, the snow nearly gone now, revealing dark earth beneath. Spring was close. I could feel it in the way the forest seemed to stretch, preparing to move forward. "There's a path that leads beyond the ridge," he said, falling into step beside me. "It connects to the lower villages. If you choose to go, it's safer than the main road." The word choose mattered. He had always spoken that way, never assuming, never pressing. I walked with him for a while before answering, letting the sound of our footsteps settle my thoughts. "I'm not ready to leave today," I said finally, "but I don't want to pretend that I'll stay forever without question." A faint smile touched his expression, brief but sincere. Then we understand each other. We stopped at the edge of the clearing, the forest opening outward into rolling hills touched by morning light. The bond between us stirred, not pulling, not urging, simply present, like a quiet promise neither of us needed to speak aloud. "I don't know what this will become," I admitted. He turned to face me fully. "Neither do I, and that's all right." For the first time, I reached out, my fingers brushing his sleeve, a small, deliberate gesture. The warmth that answered was immediate and steady, grounding rather than overwhelming. We stood there for a long moment, two lives paused between what had been and what might be. No declarations, no demands, just the understanding that whatever came next would not arrive suddenly or violently. It would unfold the way everything else had so far, slowly, quietly, and by choice. The decision to stay didn't feel like a turning point. It felt like an exhale. Life in the cabin continued much as it had before, with a subtle ease that hadn't been there in the beginning. The days no longer felt borrowed. They felt given. I moved through them without the quiet tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. the constant readiness to leave, to explain myself, to justify my presence. Now, I simply was. Some mornings we worked side by side in companionable silence, mending things that didn't truly need repair. Other days, he left early to tend to matters beyond the forest, returning by dusk with the calm weight of responsibility settling easily back onto his shoulders. He never spoke of what lay beyond the trees unless I asked, and I never felt shut out because of it. In the evenings, we shared the fire again. Sometimes we talked about small things, memories that surfaced without warning, quiet hopes neither of us framed as plans. Other times, we simply listened to the wind moving through the trees, the gentle crackle of embers, the sound of breathing that no longer felt like something to be aware of. One night, as the fire burned low, he spoke without looking at me. "There will come a time when others notice," he said, "not because we are careless, but because bonds like this don't remain unseen forever." I nodded slowly. "And when they do?" "Then we face it," he replied calmly. "Not all at once, not loudly, just honestly." The steadiness of his words settled something in me. I realized that whatever lay ahead no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a continuation, another quiet step along a path that had already proven itself gentle. Later, as I lay beneath the blankets, sleep came easily again. The bond rested within me like a constant warmth, no longer something I questioned or examined. It simply existed, steady and sure. And in that calm, I understood something simple and true. Staying a little longer wasn't delaying my life. It was becoming it. The forest began to change as the days passed, almost imperceptibly at first. Patches of dark earth emerged where snow had once lingered, and the air carried the faint scent of damp soil and new growth. I noticed it most in the mornings when I stepped outside and felt the quiet promise of spring settling into the land. It mirrored something inside me, a sense of gentle unfolding, of becoming without effort. He grew a little busier then, though never distant. There were days when messengers arrived at the edge of the clearing, their presence respectful, brief. He met them alone, speaking softly, returning to the cabin with the same calm he always carried. "You don't have to stay hidden," he said one evening, noticing my hesitation when voices carried through the trees. "No one here would harm you." "I know," I replied. "It's not fear, just habit." He understood that, I could tell. Habits formed quietly, after all, and left just as quietly when they were ready. That night we sat closer by the fire than we ever had before. Not touching, but near enough that warmth moved easily between us. The bond felt steady, almost content, as if it recognized the moment for what it was. "The world beyond these trees hasn't stopped," he said thoughtfully, "but it doesn't have to rush us." I leaned back slightly, letting my shoulder rest against the arm of his chair. It was a small thing, but deliberate. The warmth that answered felt like quiet approval, not from him, but from the bond itself. "I'm not afraid of what comes next," I said softly. "I just don't want to lose this." "You won't," he replied without hesitation. "This isn't something the world takes away." Outside, the forest listened, holding the moment gently. I realized then that whatever waited beyond the trees was no longer something that pulled me forward with uncertainty. It would wait, just as patiently as we had. The first time someone spoke to me directly, it felt almost unreal. She appeared at the Yakia edge of the clearing one afternoon, her steps slow and respectful, her presence careful not to intrude. I had been outside brushing snow from a bench near the cabin when I sensed her there, not through the bond, but through the subtle shift in the quiet around me. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said gently. I turned, surprised but not afraid. She was an Omega, older than me, her hair threaded with silver, her expression warm rather than curious. She carried a basket at her hip, herbs spilling softly over the edge. "No," I replied. "You're not." She smiled, relief easing her shoulders. "Good. I was asked to bring these. For the cabin." I took the basket, feeling the simple kindness of the gesture settle into me. "Thank you." Her gaze flicked briefly toward the cabin, then back to me. There was no judgment there, only understanding. "It's peaceful here," she said, He's always chosen this place when the world grows too loud. I can see why, I said quietly. She nodded once, satisfied, then turned to leave without further questions. As she disappeared back into the trees, I realized something had shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be felt. I was no longer invisible. That evening, I told him about the encounter. He listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned. "They'll notice," he said calmly, "but they'll follow my lead. And my lead is patience." The reassurance in his voice grounded me. The bond warmed, steady and present, as if echoing his certainty. Later, as the fire burned low, I watched the flames dance quietly and understood something new. Being seen didn't feel like exposure. It felt like acknowledgement, a gentle recognition that I belonged here, not as a secret, but as a choice. And for the first time, I wondered not whether the world would accept us, but how quietly it already had. After that day, the forest seemed to breathe a little easier. It wasn't that more people arrived. They didn't. Life remained quiet, measured, respectful of the space we shared. But there was a subtle shift in how the cabin was regarded, as if its presence had been gently acknowledged by the world beyond the trees. Small signs appeared without ceremony. A bundle of firewood stacked neatly at the edge of the clearing one morning. Fresh bread wrapped in linen left on the bench another evening. No names, no explanations, just offerings given and accepted without discussion. I mentioned them once, uncertain. "You don't have to, I know," he said calmly. "But letting others give is its own kind of kindness." That thought stayed with me. The bond felt quieter now, settled into something steady and unremarkable in the best way. It didn't surge or pull. It simply existed, like the warmth of the hearth, like the certainty that night would follow day. One afternoon, as clouds gathered softly overhead, I found myself walking the path alone. Not far, just enough to feel the forest around me without needing to watch my steps. I realized then how natural it felt to move here, how my body no longer held itself in readiness to flee. When I returned, he was waiting by the cabin, as if he had sensed the moment I would reappear. "You're comfortable," he observed. "Yes," I said. I didn't realize how much that mattered. He nodded. Comfort is often the first truth we recognize. Everything else follows. That night, as rain tapped lightly against the roof and the fire cast gentle shadows along the walls, I felt a quiet certainty settle into place. Not about the future, not about titles or decisions, but about here. This place was no longer a pause between chapters. It was a chapter of its own, unfolding slowly, exactly as it was meant to. Time moved differently after that, not slower exactly, just softer. Days no longer felt like things to be counted or measured. They unfolded in their own way, marked by small rituals that grounded me more than any calendar ever had. Morning light across the table, the sound of water heating, the quiet understanding of shared space. I noticed how easily my presence fit into his life, and how easily his had settled into mine. There was no moment where it happened, no clear line crossed, just a gradual easing, like snow melting into earth without announcement. Sometimes we worked in the same room, each absorbed in our own quiet tasks. Other times we walked the forest paths together, our steps unhurried, conversation drifting in and out without effort. The bond stayed constant, not demanding attention, not fading, simply there, like a steady pulse beneath everything else. One evening, as the sky deepened into dusk, we sat outside and watched the first stars appear. "You've changed," he said quietly. I considered that for a moment. "So have you." A hint of a smile touched his expression. Perhaps, or perhaps I've just stopped resisting it. The thought settled gently between us. There was no weight to it, no pressure, just truth. As the air cooled, I drew my cloak closer, and without a word he shifted nearer, close enough that warmth moved easily between us, not touching, just present. The bond responded with a quiet warmth that felt content rather than urgent. Later, lying in bed with the window cracked just enough to hear the forest breathe, I realized something simple. The bond no longer felt like something that had happened to me. It felt like something I was actively choosing, Each calm morning, each unhurried evening, each quiet moment of shared presence. And in that choice, there was no fear, only peace, settling deeper with every passing day. It was the smallest things that made me realize how deeply I had settled. The way my hands reached automatically for a second cup when I poured tea. The way I knew where he would be without looking, sensed his presence even, when the cabin was quiet. The way the forest no longer felt like something around me, but something I was within. Home, I realized, was not a place that demanded permanence. It was a place that welcomed you without question. One afternoon, while the light drifted lazily across the clearing, he returned from the path with a bundle tucked beneath his arm. He set it on the table and unfolded the cloth carefully. Seeds. Simple ones. Roots and herbs, nothing ornamental, nothing urgent. I thought, he said, almost casually, we could plant them near the cabin, for the warmer months. The word we settled warmly in my chest. I'd like that, I replied. We worked side by side, the soil cool beneath our fingers, the air carrying the promise of growth. It was quiet work, unhurried. When we finished, the earth looked no different than it had before, but I knew what lay beneath the surface. That night, as dusk wrapped the forest in deepening blue, we sat near the fire again. He spoke of nothing pressing. I spoke of nothing distant. The world beyond the trees felt real, but no longer intrusive. Before I slept, I paused at the doorway to my room, turning back to him. I don't feel like I'm waiting anymore, I said softly. He met my gaze, calm and steady. Neither do I. Sleep came gently, carrying with it the sense that whatever lay ahead would grow the way those seeds would, quietly, patiently, and in its own time. And for now, that was enough. The evening settled in slowly, as if the day itself was reluctant to end. Clouds drifted lazily across the sky, thinning enough to let moonlight spill through in pale ribbons. The forest grew still, the kind of stillness that feels intentional rather than empty. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its warmth steady and familiar. I was mending a tear in one of the blankets when I felt it, not a surge, not a pull, but a gentle awareness sharpening into clarity. The bond, patient as it had always been, seemed to pause, waiting. He noticed it too. You feel it, he said quietly. Yes, I replied, setting the needle aside. My hands were steady, my breath calm. He didn't move closer right away. Instead, he spoke as if the words mattered enough to be placed carefully. I've known for some time, he said, but I didn't want to name it until you were ready to hear it. I met his gaze, the firelight softening the lines of his face. I think I am now. The bond warmed between us, no longer subtle, no longer something that hid beneath the surface. It didn't overwhelm. It simply was, open and honest. This isn't something I claim, he continued, and it isn't something you owe. It's a bond that exists because we chose to let it. I nodded, feeling the truth of it resonate deeply. It feels gentle. That's because it's real, he said. Silence followed, not the kind that avoids words, but the kind that respects them. When he finally moved closer, it was slow, deliberate. He stopped just within reach, close enough that warmth flowed easily between us. I won't rush what this becomes, he said, but I won't deny it either. I reached out then, my fingers brushing his hand, resting there without tension or fear. The bond settled fully into place, not locking us into anything, but grounding us both. Neither will I said softly. The fire crackled quietly, as if acknowledging the moment without demanding attention. Outside, the forest breathed, unchanged and accepting. Nothing dramatic followed, no sudden shift, no thunder or declaration, just two lives gently aligned, and a truth spoken aloud, finally at rest. Nothing changed all at once after that. And yet, everything felt subtly different. The cabin held the same quiet warmth, the fire burned as steadily as ever, and the forest outside breathed in its familiar rhythm. But beneath it all, there was a new ease, a sense that something important had been placed gently where it belonged. We moved through the evening without ceremony. Tea was poured. The blanket I'd been mending was folded and set aside. Our conversation drifted easily, touching on small, ordinary things that no longer felt small at all. Later, when it was time to rest, he paused near the hearth. "You can stay here tonight," he said, his voice low and calm, "if you'd rather." The offer was simple, open, free of expectation. I considered it for only a moment before nodding. I'd like that. He prepared the space without fuss, laying an extra blanket near the fire. When we settled, it was with careful distance, close enough to share warmth, far enough to honor the gentleness that had carried us this far. The bond hummed softly, content. As sleep began to pull at the edges of my awareness, I listened to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the steady breathing beside me, the fire settling into embers, the wind brushing past the walls. Everything felt anchored, unhurried, whole. I realized then that the bond did not need constant attention. It did not need proof or promises. It lived in the calm between moments, in shared warmth, in unspoken understanding, in the choice to remain. Sleep came gently, carrying me with it, and for the first time, I didn't wonder what tomorrow would ask of me. I trusted that whatever it brought, we would meet it the same way we had met everything else, quietly, together. When I woke the next morning, there was no moment of disorientation, no sudden remembering, no need to orient myself. I simply opened my eyes and lay still, listening. The cabin was quiet, wrapped in that familiar, steady calm. Fire embers glowed faintly in the hearth, and somewhere nearby I could hear the slow rhythm of breathing that was not my own. The sound didn't startle me. It grounded me. I stayed there for a while, letting the warmth seep into my awareness. The bond rested quietly within me, not drawing attention to itself, just present, like a gentle hand resting at my back. When I finally moved, it was slowly, careful not to disturb the peace of the moment. I rose, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and stepped outside. Morning had arrived softly. Mist hovered low among the trees, curling lazily around trunks and branches. The forest smelled clean and damp, the air cool against my skin. I breathed deeply, feeling the quiet stretch of the day ahead, unclaimed, unhurried. He joined me after a while, standing beside me without a word. We watched the light shift together, neither of us needing to speak to acknowledge it. "This feels like the right kind of quiet," I murmured. He nodded. "The kind you don't have to fill." We stayed there until the mist thinned and the day gently asked us to move forward, not because we had to, but because we were ready. As days passed, routine settled around us like a familiar cloak. There was comfort in knowing what came next, not because it was predictable, but because it was gentle. Mornings began with warmth and quiet movement. Afternoons drifted by in soft focus. Evenings always returned us to the fire. I found myself humming sometimes as I worked, the sound low and absent-minded. He never commented on it, but I noticed the way his presence seemed to soften whenever I did. We spoke little about the bond now. It no longer needed explanation. It showed itself in small ways, in the way he waited when I slowed, in the way I reached for him without thinking when the air grew cold. One afternoon, while rain tapped lightly against the roof, I realized I had stopped counting how long I'd been there. The thought didn't unsettle me. It felt like a quiet relief. Nights stretched longer, not because darkness pressed in, but because neither of us rushed toward sleep. We sat near the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes simply listening to the soft sounds of the cabin settling around us. Shadows moved lazily across the walls, and the warmth of the hearth wrapped the room in steady comfort. At times, my thoughts drifted, not to worries, but to simple reflections. How easily I had come to rest here. How natural it felt to share space without filling it with words. The bond pulsed softly, in time with my breathing. When sleep finally came, it did so gently, like being guided rather than pulled. There was a moment one afternoon when I realized I had stopped listening for footsteps. In the beginning, I'd always been aware of where he was, not out of fear, but habit, a quiet readiness that lingered beneath every thought. Now, that awareness had softened into something gentler. I no longer needed to track his presence. I trusted it. I was sitting near the window, watching clouds drift slowly across the sky, when he returned from the forest. I didn't look up right away. I didn't need to. I felt the calm shift in the room as he entered, the bond responding with its familiar warmth. "You're comfortable," he said quietly, not as a question. "Yes," I replied, smiling to myself. "I think I've been comfortable for a while now." He paused, then sat across from me, close enough that the space between us felt intentional rather than empty. Outside, the clouds continued their slow journey, unconcerned with time or borders. "That's how belonging works," he said. "It arrives quietly, then stays." The words settled into me easily, finding a place they seemed to have been waiting for. The days filled themselves with small, steady tasks. We tended to the space around the cabin, clearing fallen branches, checking the garden beds we had prepared together. The work was unremarkable, and that was what made it meaningful. There was no urgency to finish, no pressure to do more than felt right. Sometimes we worked side by side without speaking, our movements naturally aligning. Other times, conversation drifted in and out, light and unforced. We spoke of nothing that demanded resolution. The bond remained calm, constant, like a steady thread woven through every moment. When evening came, we washed our hands, shared a simple meal, and returned to the fire. The routine felt less like repetition and more like reassurance. That night, sleep came quickly. I lay listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, wood settling, embers shifting, the distant call of something moving through the forest. None of it stirred worry. None of it demanded attention. My thoughts slowed, drifting gently, unanchored by plans or questions. The bond rested within me, warm and steady, as familiar now as my own breath. I realized then that nothing in this place asked me to be anything other than what I already was. And in that understanding, my body relaxed completely. Days blended together after that, not in a way that erased them, but in a way that smoothed their edges. Morning light, warmth by the fire, quiet work, rest. Each element returned again and again, comforting in its familiarity. I stopped wondering what day it was. I stopped counting how many nights had passed. Time no longer felt like something moving forward. It felt like something holding us gently in place. There came a day when I realized I hadn't thought about leaving in a long while. The idea didn't frighten me, and it didn't feel forbidden. It simply no longer occupied space in my thoughts. The cabin, the forest, the quiet rhythm we shared. They had become the background of my days, steady and reassuring. That morning, the sky was overcast, clouds moving slowly overhead. I sat near the window, watching light shift across the trees. He was outside, splitting wood with unhurried movements, each strike measured and calm. I listened to the sound, steady and grounding, until it faded back into silence. When he came inside, he carried the scent of the forest with him, clean air, damp earth, pine. He set the wood neatly by the hearth and met my gaze. "You look settled," he said. "I feel settled," I replied. He nodded once as if that was the answer he'd been expecting. That evening was unremarkable in the best possible way. We shared a simple meal, spoke a little, then let the conversation fade. The fire burned low, its light soft and constant. Outside, the forest rested beneath the weight of night. I leaned back in my chair, eyes half closed, listening to the familiar sounds around me. The bond hummed quietly, content, no longer something that drew focus, just a part of the space we shared. At some point, he rose to add another log to the fire. The flames responded gently, warmth spreading through the room. He returned to his seat close enough that I could feel the heat of him without effort. Nothing needed to be said. Sleep came easily that night. There were no lingering thoughts, no restless turns beneath the blankets. My body relaxed fully, trusting the quiet, trusting the space, trusting the presence beside me. As my thoughts drifted, I felt a simple certainty settle into place. This wasn't a pause. It wasn't a waiting period. It was a life unfolding slowly, deliberately, without urgency. And that was enough. Morning light arrived as it always did, softly, without demand. I woke to warmth and quiet, the cabin wrapped in its familiar stillness. The forest outside breathed gently, unchanged and welcoming. Nothing pressed forward, nothing pulled away. I lay there for a moment, listening, feeling the steady calm that had become second nature. The bond rested quietly within me, no longer something to notice, simply something that was. There were no decisions waiting, no endings rushing toward me. Only another day, opening gently, ready to be lived at its own pace. And in that calm, the story found its natural rest. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this cozy fantasy romance story, please like the video, subscribe to SofiaWorlds for more gentle stories like this, and leave a comment if you're listening from somewhere cozy tonight. Sweet dreams.